for Leave the Bus to the Broken Window, Andrew Hevia. So this film, as I mentioned before to you, kind of took me by surprise. I knew nothing about it, and I was plunged into this travel log, diary, failed experiments. How would you call it?
How would I call it? Not to sound like, in my mind, yes, it's a documentary, but it's a little bit of creative nonfiction.
Creative nonfiction, right?
Because it's a very personal, like there's a memoir aspect to it.
Yeah. That sounds about right, I'd say. So it's set in Hong Kong, where you spend 10 months. Originally to do a more traditional documentary on something else, and then
the way I pitch it is that the movie, I'd won a grant to make a documentary about art, but immediately got lost inside a shopping mall, so instead made a movie about my feelings.
And so, for example, obviously, like Hong Kong now, there's a situation going on, and watching this film now, even though by now it's far removed in time, but there's still some sort of acknowledging of that. There are scenes in which you stumble upon a protest, a riot, which I would assume is the fishbowl riots, based on the timeline. Because it was 2016.
You've done research.
I'm very interested in the Hong Kong thing, but like it's not planned, but it is quite striking how something that the film is coming now from a few years before, and it depicts that, and obviously that speaks to there's been a history of protests in Hong Kong basically for the last 20 years, here and there, and now they're getting more and more.
What was so, when I landed, my very naive idea was that I could make a film about the artists and about their struggles, dealing with and around and succeeding next to the spotlight of this international art fair. But when I got there, what became very clear to me is that the conversation in Hong Kong was something else entirely, and the conversation was much more about what will Hong Kong look like in the next 30 years? Mm-hmm. And that was a conversation I was not only unprepared for, it was a conversation I did not feel qualified to speak on. But when I got there, when I arrived, it had been 2 years since the umbrella protest. And the fallout of that, the consequence of that, the aftermath of that, was reflected in so much of the art that I was seeing. Mm. So I was forced to become aware and try to at least acknowledge and recognize what was influencing the artists and the work that they were doing. And so in the period I was living, there was a period of calm in between the umbrella protest and the protests happening this current year. And I like, that's not at all what the film is about, but the context of Hong Kong's political situation is absolutely it's helpful in understanding sort of where the movie fits. Mm-hmm. Because what's happening now is a very distressing situation that didn't come out of nowhere.
So in the film, there's this sense of, as you say, an acknowledgement of I'm not part of this culture enough to engage with it fully, and so the documentary, the film is a repetition of you adapting to that in a way. But how much of that is a sort of like an artistic evaluation of the thing from afterwards, and how much?
So there was, one of the things I love about documentary is that the rules that we seem to think define a documentary are invented. Like, they're not true. Documentary is a form of storytelling, and storytelling is something we do in our everyday life. So there's a lot more freedom in the medium, and it's something Carlos and I really gravitated toward. Carlos, my producer and editor on the movie, my collaborator, And so I really loved the idea that there was a certain amount of construction, a narrative construction, because life is messy. I filmed for 10 months. I have so much footage. And somehow you have to condense that into, into a feature-length film that has a cohesive story that helps you get from A to B. So there's a lot of construction of the character. And where I felt completely comfortable, I don't want to, manipulating is not the word, but building was in the character of myself. I was like, I have access to myself 24/7. I can say things that I would never say about a subject I'm interviewing, things that are deeply embarrassing that I can just put out there because they're mine. And if I have to rearrange some facts of my own life to make the story work, I can be fiction. So everything in the movie is honest from my life, but it didn't necessarily happen in that order or that way or for that reason. So the construction of the character, of sort of the bumbling filmmaker, was definitely a choice that evolved as the edit evolved, and it became an opportunity. Once we understood like the way in, it became an opportunity to explore a lot of things from what I think was the right perspective, which is the perspective I experienced it by, rather than the sort of removed documentarian who speaks with authority. And I was like, I don't have that authority.
Sure, but a removed documentarian could also artfully simulate the perspective of the
bumbling
of
idiot,
your character there. So that's interesting because, of course, I see the shift in presenting that not as a documentarian's work,
right?
But how deep does the fiction go? Because that's the interesting thing in yourself, like as you said.
Yeah, no. I mean, so I think a part of it was one, acknowledging just how outside the culture I was, and how me picking sides because of who told me, or me understanding the art without understanding the context, it was such a dangerous position because it's so tempting to be like, oh, I get it. But in so many ways, that's not my story to tell. The thing about Hong Kong is, so Hong Kong has a well-worn expat bubble. And because of the colonial history, it's very easy for a guy like me to show up speaking English, be a white guy showing up, and find restaurants and social groups and activities and things I can do that never deviate from that very well-worn path. Yeah. And recognizing how isolated I was important for me to understand the position I should take. What I'm so grateful for is that with the documentary, I was given access to and allowed into and invited into spaces that just as a white American expat, I wouldn't have been invited to. So I got to go to restaurants that, nobody speaks English, they couldn't have served me, but I went with a friend who was local, who spoke Cantonese, and was able to order the things and just sort of take care of me. So I was able to be a guest, and I think there's a certain amount of politeness there where it says it's not mine to comment on, but I can tell you how I felt. I really enjoyed the food. Not that the food was good or bad, I enjoyed it or I didn't. Sure. And I think there's a very clear difference there. So taking that point of view just sort of kept me honest.
Okay. And I mean, it's funny because the film makes big part of the film is the living space that you are in, which is like obviously comically small, as you would expect, but also it's in Saigon, which is the sort of area in which you would find the bubble. Like you walk in there. And
I mean, the joke in the movie is that I live next to a craft brewery, a CrossFit, and a vape shop. So yeah, it's like super Western. So I felt comfortable, and the people who were living in that apartment complex were expats and students and travelers. So there was a very cosmopolitan, international sense. What was interesting to me was when I met some of the other residents, and they all had very good reasons for living there. One was a student, one was an intern, one lived and worked in Hong Kong, had been there for several years, but was sending money home. So he was like, I'm never home, I work all the time, and the more money I save, the more money I can send back to my family. So everyone made choices, and one of the things I thought was important in the movie was to show the living space and show my reaction to it, but also not to talk down to it, if that makes sense. Only because, like, with the wrong music, with the Sarah McLachlan music, it's a very sad orphaned animals kind of video. Like, the people live in such small closets. Yeah. But I acclimated, and in the end, really grew to love the space. And I think I say that in the movie, but it's not a joke. Like, I got comfortable and realized that I don't need the things that I have, and that the size of the room we're in right now, it could fit 8 people. comfortably. Because once I got over the things that I've been acculturated to in the States, it's a living place. What more do you need? Go outside. And there were parks with free Wi-Fi. Like, there were great things. And it was a priority shift that I had to make. And yes, my immediate reaction was very physical. But over time, it became normalized.
Mm-hmm. And there's a distinct feeling of in the voice that you take in the film has a voiceover which is rendered through text-to-speech, so it's got that effect.
Right, Siri is narrating
somehow, it's a somehow common, I would say, device of this era. So it also it comes with a whole world of its own, and this voice speaks to you in the second person. Like this feels there's something of Chris Marker in it, of Saint-Soleil. What was that a point of reference, and what else aside from the idea of like I'm not doing the traditional documentary form?
So there were a couple of things. What's funny is, I'll reveal my own ignorance here. I hadn't seen Saint-Soleil until I was in Hong Kong. And an artist I was interviewing was like, "Oh, you mean like Saint-Soleil?" And I'm like, "Of course." And then I had to be like, "What is he talking about?" And I watched the movie much later in the process. But partly the narrator for me, the story is that the narrator came out of necessity first. Mm-hmm. And what that was is I was editing in a co-working space. And when I do voiceover, there is a very sort of obsessive repetition where I say the lines. I didn't like the cadence. I didn't like the phrasing. Oh, I slurred a word there. So I'm just constantly recycling and repeating. And I couldn't control the room for silence. So it didn't work with my process. So I was like, well, the text-to-speech, I can type it in. It's a template, it's a placeholder. And I can have headphones and no one will know that I'm endlessly repeating it. But over the time, I learned to speak robot. I got better. If you capitalize this word, if you space that word, she'll say a certain way. And her rhythm, her cadence started to influence the edit. Mm-hmm. So she became sort of slowly, sort of organically interwoven into the piece. But the thing that really stuck out for me is once we settled on the second person, what I loved about it was that it's alienating in a way that is destabilizing. And one of the things that I felt living in Hong Kong is like, look, everyone speaks English. It's a very easy to navigate city. Graphic, signs post you where you need to go. Everything is clean. The design is straightforward. But every time I cross the street, you look down and there's painted script that says "Look this way." It says "Look this way" and an arrow pointing. So that in this country, the cars come from this direction or this direction.
Yeah, same in the UK.
A constant reminder that I'm not home.
Yeah.
And the things that I think, cars always come from this side of the street. This is how you go here. I went my first week there. I got kicked off a city bus because I skipped the line. Ooh. And in New York, it's elbows up, get on the bus. And in Hong Kong, they were like, that was impolite. Get off the bus, get back in the line. You're the last one on. And the level of civility, and like process and rules that I just did not know meant I never felt like I was on firm ground. And having the narrator speak at you so that you as an audience member go, you do this, I didn't do this, oh, he did this. And that ping pong, that calculation, my hope was that it would destabilize you in the way that I felt.
Yeah.
So you'd be a little bit off kilter.
It really piles down the voice, like it makes you, the character, really feel like constantly talked down to.
You know who did a really good job of this is Dave Eggers wrote a book called You Shall Know You Shall Know Our Velocity. You Shall Know Our Velocity. And what he does in the book is it's a book he is writing, but he constructs a character of the writer in the same way that Chris Marker does in Saint-Soleil, where she talks about the letters he wrote. He wrote me in a letter, she says. And what I love about this is it means the narration is speaking to a person who doesn't exist, but by nature of that, this person becomes more real. This person who's off screen becomes like a real entity, and you imagine a life where the movie exists, but was made by a fictional person So in the Dave Eggers example, he became less of a real author to me, and the fictional shield he put up became the guy who wrote the book. And I wondered what he was doing, and how he came about, and why he wrote this book, and what his motivations were. And then the book lived in my head beyond what I was reading.
Sure.
And it became an artifact of reality that never existed. And like I'm obsessed with that.
And I found the most Chris Marker part, the one that deals with your previous relationship in a way.
Really?
And with the most, where you could see the emotional angle kind of sneak through the whole thing, through all the layers, being displays, being the cultural element, the art element, but like there are here and there those moments in which you speak about a relationship that just ended and then that comes back in different ways. There's this girl that you meet there. So again, how much of that did you tweak and repurpose as the documentarian and as the negation of the documentarian?
So what I will say is that the process of the edit was about getting the movie to a place where it could be more personal. Like I had to become vulnerable over the course of the edit, and a lot of that is a testament to my collaboration with Carlos Rivera, because Carlos, who's a dear friend of mine, would watch the footage, would watch the edit, would talk about it, and then would say, listen, there's something else going on here. We're going to need to go deeper, because like the paintings are fine, but I need to know why you're in that room. I need to know what's happening here, what motivated you. And the way I joke about it is that he was 70% editor, 30% therapist. And we'd have a conversation about something going on in my life. He'd be like, wait, you need to put that in the film. And I trusted him enough that I was willing to put in those moments that are kind of vulnerable, moments that are maybe a little humiliating. I think in several of them, I don't come off in the best way. But because I trusted my collaborator, I was willing to figure, you know what, like, there's no harm here. Once you put that secret out there, it lives and it doesn't.
It's pretty incredible that you had this person.
Yes.
That's
yes.
Because of this, because of the fact that you say that when you arrived back home, you basically offered to take all of this massive footage.
So Carlos had been he'd been tracking the project, and someone I shared sort of my plans with, because the truth is I knew when I was going to Hong Kong that I was going to try to experiment. I wanted to find a way to tell the story that in a way I thought would be interesting, the story of Hong Kong and the art community and sort of what was going on there. I didn't know what I would find, and he flagged early. He was like, "Hey, keep me in the loop. I want to know." So when I left Hong Kong, I left with what I considered like a rough cut. Turns out it was barely an assembly, but I thought it was a rough cut of the movie, and I thought I was pretty close to done. And I showed it to a very small group of friends. Carlos was one of them, and he sees that edit, and he turns to me and he says, "Listen, I like what you're trying to do, but you're not there yet. I think we can go further." And because I trusted him, and because he's an incredibly talented and very skilled storyteller.
Would you say that this is a sort of similar dynamic to, for example, what you did with Moonlight, with the play that you got, and then chasing Barry Jenkins, and sort of like trying to put these two people together?
Is Carlos me in this scenario? Someone who's like so possessed with an idea? That's an interesting take. Maybe. I would say yes. Carlos was. Here's what I will say. Carlos was driven by. He saw a version of this movie before I did, and together we worked to build it.
Okay.
And his faith in the project and his faith in what it could be, and the way we challenged each other. Once we got into the edit, the process became, how do we surprise ourselves? Because we both had work outside of the project. With Moonlight doing the things that I'd done, I had opportunities as a producer to do more conventional sort of, when I say conventional, I mean simply like recognized forms of fiction, storytelling. And Carlos, as an editor, was working on very high profile, unscripted television projects. And we would get together and say, well, how do we do the opposite of the thing we just had to do?
Mm-hmm.
And we force ourselves to set up barriers and obstacles that we had to overcome.
Okay. And just last thing, there's an aesthetics of the vlog, like the whole because I know that this sort of was also meant to be. I've seen your YouTube channel with the little.
The amount of research you've done is amazing.
The little videos in there, like, it's amazing in a way that this didn't become just a YouTube channel.
There's a longer conversation. I have no idea if
Yes.
this is interesting,
Yeah,
but the conversation, ideally, like, I have this idea. So Sherman's March, honestly, was more of a direct inspiration than Sans Soleil. Sans Soleil is the thing like I aspire to, and I'm humbled by the fact that you mentioned them in the same room. Sherman's March was the format, but I've had this conversation in my head about how Sherman's March in the present day is Casey Neistat, right?
That's what I was getting at.
And the idea of the video blog where people are just putting it out there, and I think that's fascinating. I think people overlook the form of storytelling that's happening currently. Because, like, look, if when Sherman's March came out, it was a mind-blowing movie. It was one of the top-grossing documentaries of all time up until, like, Fahrenheit 9/11 came out. Like, this movie changed people's idea of what documentary could be. If it came out today, it would barely ripple.
Yeah.
And that's because the lessons of that movie are being consumed every single day by millions of people who go to Casey Neistat's YouTube channel and watch his daily video blog. And I had this in my head. I'll make a conventional documentary about art, and meanwhile, I'm going to become like a YouTube influencer and shoot these videos. But he's superhuman, and the amount of time he sleeps is not sustainable.
In a way, the gravitational pull of that whole thing now is just so strong that I would imagine it's also hard to resist. It's hard to get out of. It's hard to get out from under that.
Right.
In terms of like, okay, I've got this footage. What is this?
Right.
And so I was also thinking about that when you were sort of deciding how to make a film out of this. But at the same time, like, you have this. This feels like it should probably 9 times out of 10 go in that direction, which is now the dominating form.
Yeah, so what happened is I was trying to do both and ended up filming the YouTube videos but never editing them. And then when Carlos saw the film, he goes, look, you have all this other footage and we can build a personal story here. I mean, there's a shot in the movie of me climbing down from the bed in my underwear. Like, I don't remember filming that or know why I filmed it, but Carlos found that and was like, hey, this is a deeply vulnerable moment, and as if I was going to put that on YouTube, but we were able to interweave them because I think that's a conversation and borrowing the language from the dominant form, borrowing the language from the popular media, which is YouTube. Yeah. It's certainly not experimental documentaries. So yeah, I think
that's why it's a marvel that this exists now like this in a way.
Yeah, I'll take it. Thank you. What I am endlessly fascinated by the sort of new forms of video and storytelling going on, from everything from TikTok to YouTube, because I think there's too often separation. The film is sort of like a static thing, and we seem to think that there's like a high or low quality to it. But where are storytellers of today going? They're working every day. Our system is bunk. They've got a whole new platform, and medium, and audience.
Okay, thank you.
No,
that's it.
Hey, this is Eric from IONCINEMA.com. If you want to support us, subscribe below. For more reviews, interviews, film festival coverage from Sundance, Cannes, Toronto, you want to check out these guys on this side.